My next guest says the economy has been showing signs of life with the stock market on a 7-day winning streak. He also says things are about to get even better. Greg Ip, U.S. economics editor of The Economist magazine and the author of The Little Book of Economics, joins me now. Greg, it's a pleasure. Welcome to Freedom Watch. What do you see that is so different from the free market and Austrian economists who see gloom and doom coming in the future, who see inflation and unemployment and taxes all going up?
Okay, maybe I'm just a more optimistic guy. Look, I actually think the Austrians might have a point. And it goes like this. After a recession that's as deep as the one we had, you would normally expect the economy to be growing around 6 to 8% right now. That's what it did back in 1983. When we had a recession of comparable depth. We're only growing about 3 or 4%. Right. But here's the thing. 3 or 4 months ago, people were so gloomy. They thought they were talking double dip. They were talking stagnation. They were talking it's Japan all over again. The unemployment rate is never going to come down. I always thought that was overdone. And the reason it's overdone is, number one, we have fundamental strengths that are better than, say, Japan had. And the situation you have here is after a financial crisis that's caused by too much debt. People want to pay down that debt. But as long as they don't pay it down too fast, there's room for the economy to grow. And that, in fact, is what we have seen. We just got information a few days ago that after declining for a couple of years, the amount of money that people, consumers, are willing to borrow has started to go up. And if you talk to banks, as the Fed does, they do these quarterly surveys, they find that banks are finally easing the standards under which they make loans after tightening them consistently for several years.
Let me be the skunk at your garden party, because I do believe in the Austrian view of economics, and I do believe that this is going to get worse before it gets better. So a couple of observations for you, and you take them as you see fit. The stock market is just one measure of how well the economy is doing. There is still at least 1 in 10 adults of working age and working capability who can't find a job. At least that's the number of people that are filing for unemployment. There are some people who've been unemployed for so long they can't file anymore. So the number of people who can work and are out of it is probably greater than 1 in 10. So question, Greg, and you know I love your publication and read it every week. What kind of a recovery can there be when it's essentially jobless?
Look, I agree. We've had for some time this two-speed recovery where Wall Street does great and Main Street is really suffering. And there have been some positive signs on that. However, we did start creating meaningful numbers of private sector jobs back in August. The unemployment rate has come down fairly sharply in the last 2 months. Now, it's not perhaps as good as it looks, because if you actually look beneath the surface, one of the reasons unemployment isn't even higher is that so many people have simply stopped looking for work.
Right. So
it's going to be, I'm not, I don't want to sugarcoat this. It's going to be a long, slow climb back.
All right, let me raise that other demon lurking out there that we see little signs of here and there. We see it in the price of milk. We see it in the price of fresh fruit. Inflation. At some point, Ben Bernanke is just going to have to stop what he calls quantitative easing, flooding the market with cash, because inflation is going to start to hurt and sting everyday people, and that may cause more joblessness, right?
Well, it kind of depends on where the inflation is coming from. The thing you've got going on now is that oil prices, for example, are very high, not because there's a lot of demand for it here in the United States, but because there's so much demand for it in the emerging markets, which are growing so strongly. And actually, when you have the price of oil and other commodities going up, not because of demand here in the U.S., but because of demand abroad, that can actually hurt growth here. It can actually, under some circumstances, force inflation down later on. Here's what you have to do. When you print money, as the Fed is doing now, it only creates inflation if the money gets lent by the banks and spent by the borrowers. And that's not going on right now. Bank credit still contracting. And in my view, you don't worry about inflation until you see signs that it's feeding through to wages.
We're going to look at the economy, and 2 or 3 months from now, you come back. We'll see if it's better or if it's worse. You know it'll get better as we get close to Election Day. It's a pleasure. Thanks for having you on.
All right, thank you.
Who's overpaid, hardworking private sector employees or so-called public servants? We've got disturbing facts. You can probably guess the answer to that one next.
You can now join Judge Napolitano online at foxbusiness.com/freedomwatch and take part in the live chat during the show. Simply click the live chat button and join your fellow freedom fighters as the struggle for liberty goes viral.
Those in the private sector see the government take a portion of their pay in the form of payroll taxes. And where does that money go? Well, besides going to out-of-control entitlements, it also goes to pay the salaries of government bureaucrats who, on average, make more than their equivalents in the private sector. The Heritage Foundation just released a comprehensive report on this issue. The conclusion? No surprise, federal bureaucrats are overpaid. Here now, Jason Richwine, the co-author of the report and the senior policy analyst there. Jason, welcome here. So who's overpaid and how much overpaid are they? Give us an example of private sector doing comparable work, if there is such a thing, as public sector and the pay differentials.
Well, again, it depends exactly on who you're talking about, but the average difference in terms of cash wages is probably somewhere in the range of 10 to 20%. And then you add on top of that benefits, which was going to give you another 10 or 20% on top of it. Now, it depends on who you're talking about. The best federal workers, the most skilled, the engineers, the lawyers, the accountants and things, these workers probably do not receive much of a pay premium. As skill levels go up, you see less of a pay premium. But generally speaking, if you're talking about someone with just a high school degree, that person is receiving a very large premium from the federal government.
Well, take, for example, a clerk receptionist or a personal assistant or a secretary or somebody that answers a phone. High school education, perhaps college, but not necessary. What would that person likely make in an annual salary in the private sector, and what would that person make in an annual salary after 3 or 4 years working for the federal government?
Well, I can't give you an exact number on that, but I could tell you that if the average is somewhere around 10 to 20%, you're talking about a person who receives one of the highest premiums. It could be in the 30 to 40% range, which means that if you take a private sector worker, for each dollar that he earns, a federal worker is making something like $1.30 or $1.40, assuming their skill levels are the same.
All right, so you're talking about maybe a $15,000 or $20,000 differential if the salary range is somewhere around $60,000 or $70,000. How did that come about? I mean, it used to be that public service was a sacrifice. You did it because you believed in the mission of the government. You didn't do it to get rich.
Well, it's actually been that way for quite a long time, over 3 decades, actually. And one of the purposes of the report that we issue, it's actually an article in the Weekly Standard, is to try to inject into the federal pay debate a very large academic and scholarly literature that's out there. Economists have been working on it really since the late 1970s. And their results, as I said before, have been pretty consistent. They typically find a federal pay premium in the range of 10 to 20%. It's been going on for a very long time, and I'm very hopeful that if we can get this scholarly work into the hands of Congress, then they'll finally do something about it.
How do federal salaries go up? Does the Congress vote raises? Do they get cost of living increases? Is there a scale that they follow, that they get a raise for every year they're on the job? How does that work?
It's very regular. They have a cost of living increase and they have step increases so that each year you gain experience, you automatically get more money. And in fact, when President Obama announced the pay freeze last November, it was a 2-year pay freeze, that was a freeze on the cost of living adjustment, not a freeze on the step increase. So federal workers will still get that step increase as they normally do. So actually we'll see some increases in their money anyway.
All right, before I let you go, why does the guy who runs the post office, perennially broke and the worst in the business of delivering things overnight, make more than the President of the United States?
The post office has among the highest paid federal workers in terms of relative to their skills in the private sector. All I can say is it's a very strong union. I have no other explanation for you.
All right. Jason Richwine from the Heritage Foundation. It's a good report. Thanks very much for doing it for us, and thanks for joining us here. And now a few items from our Freedom File. An unnamed student at Sierra High School in Colorado Springs, Colorado, has been prohibited from taking the anti-seizure medication that was prescribed by his family physician. That's because his doctor prescribed medical marijuana lozenges that suppress his seizures more effectively and with fewer side effects than traditional anti-seizure medicines. Even though Colorado has legalized medicinal marijuana, if this student were to take one of his pills at school, the school would accuse him of possessing an illegal drug. This school has completely lost touch with reality. It is invading his privacy. It is interfering with his relationship with his physician. But what else do you expect from a government bureaucracy? The federal government's obsession with milk regulation knows no bounds. The Food and Drug Administration banned the interstate sale of unpasteurized milk due to safety concerns. This raw milk prohibition has led to SWAT team-style drug raids on dairy farmers that we've reported about here on Freedom Watch. Because people will ingest what they want, this absurd raw milk ban has created, no surprise, one of the largest black markets in the United States. While it is true that someone can get sick from drinking unpasteurized or raw milk, that's not a reason for the FDA to ban it. The illness is temporary. It's a free choice made by the consumer. Remember, what we decide to put in our bodies is a right, not a privilege. But the government rejects this. It still wants to tell us how to live, what to eat, and apparently what to drink. And when it comes to government workers caught breaking rules on camera, the government in Canada is just as camera shy as in some states in the U.S. The Toronto Transit Commission has taken out ads requesting that bus riders there not take photos of city bus drivers while they are texting behind the wheel. What are these people afraid of? That residents and taxpayers of Toronto will realize they're paying incompetent and negligent and dangerous bus drivers? Perhaps this fear of being caught in the act would force the drivers to put down the phones and drive more safely. This goes to show that even with our neighbors to the north, the government is more concerned with saving face than saving freedom. I've said this before, and I'll say it to you again. You are free to photograph the government anywhere in public with respect to freedom and transparency. The camera is the new gun. Coming up, another day, another citizen arrested for filming the police. We expose more outrageous abuses of power after this.